in Ukraine, and most recently the attack by Hamas in Israel and the corresponding response in Gaza that illustrate there is so much that is happening despite the fact that we are pressing forward in venues like COP28 to achieve our climate ambition. To have this conversation and break it down, we brought together a esteemed panel today, and I'm very excited to be joined by Antonio Spilimbergo, who's the Deputy Director for Research Department at the International Monetary Fund, Meghan O'Sullivan, who is the Director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, Tony Agotha, Special Envoy for Climate and Environmental Diplomacy, European External Action Service, and Dr. Atul Arya, who's the Senior Vice President and Chief Energy Strategist at S&P Global Commodity Insights. We just recognizing how diverse of a panel we have, and from finance to expertise to government, why don't we dive right in? And Antonio, I really want to begin with you, because if we're going to make a change and achieve our climate ambitions, you know, we see scenarios, we see lines to net zero mid-century, but it's clearly not linear. There's so much complexity in that. And I'm really interested to hear from you, what are the short-term energy security challenges that are going to impact this energy transition, and how can we better align to make sure that we have a long-term vision of where we're headed?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. You ask a very difficult question. And it's not only difficult for me, it's especially difficult for a politician. Politicians think in terms of short-term and one objective. Here you have long-term, two big objectives. So I prepared this slide that illustrates the issue. This shows how many times energy security in blue or green transition in red is mentioned in major newspapers. As you can see, not in the US, but in the European Union, as soon as you have the Russian invasion of Crimea, you have a huge jump in the interest for green transition, for energy security. Of course, politicians look at this naturally, so they have this problem how to square two objectives, one of which is, actually, both of them are long-term. Well, the good news, and they are very difficult, because the dependency on Russian energy was very high in Europe before the invasion. There is a good and a bad news. The good news is that in the long term, the two objectives are actually complementary. We are doing a study at the IMF, which will be issued at the beginning of next year in a few weeks, where we show that actually, because of this strive for energy security, probably it will be easier to reach even green transition in the medium term. The big problem that we see is in the short term. And the big problem, and basically there are two issues there, main issues. One goes through the political system. When you give subsidies, temporary subsidies to finance, to help people, they tend to mute price incentives, and they tend to become permanent. So a temporary solution tends to have a permanent bad feature from a point of view for the green transition. The second problem is on the investment side, because investor community can get confused about the incentives and where to invest. And they may make investments which are profitable in the short term, but in the long term goes against the green transition. So how to solve these two challenges? Well, first, on the subsidies, we understand that some countries put them, but it's absolutely clear that they should be temporary and phasing out as soon as possible to provide a proper price signal. On the investment, I think that sticking to the European plan, Fit for 25, is very important to give the long-term direction of where the Union is going. So rather than trying to change and to reach two objectives, to reach short-term objectives which are not very compatible, just to focus to give a clear direction for the medium term. So in sum, in the long term, green transition and energy security are compatible, and actually they are mutually reinforcing, but in the short term, we have to be sure that the political system delivers the proper answer, articulating it in a proper way.
So, looking at the slide here, Tony, the European response to energy security is actually quite striking. And I think as we digest that in the context of where we're at right now, in Dubai, pushing forward on climate and negotiations that you're very integral to, do you see the near-term and short-term implications of energy security weighing on negotiations as we move forward on a much longer arc? What Antonio is saying, the green transition can be conducive to supporting. Is that featuring in the conversation here? And ultimately, what are your perspectives on what you can bring from a European standpoint to this dialogue to help maintain momentum?
Well, first of all, when I look at that graph, there are two conclusions I draw from the European. One is a huge interest in energy security, which is logical because we don't have a lot of oil and gas like the US does. But second of all, there's a quite constant mention of the green transition. And that's where I want to start. The EU is staying the course, despite the fact that we have been hit very heavily, and you can blame us for naivete, for a singular dependence upon Russia, with a belief in a laissez-faire and a global economy. I mean, before, when we designed the Green Deal, before this Russian invasion, we could calculate to way behind the comma what we needed, how much it would cost, and where we could source it. That has changed. But what not has changed is, and as you said, politicians think of the next electoral cycle, and a week is an eternity. But we are building for decades. And to do so, we built in a climate law, which is our political sat-nav, to keep us and the politicians on score. So in the short term, we did have to be agile. And we weaned ourselves off Russian gas from 155 BCM to 40 to 45 BCM in a very short period. We ramped up our renewables from 221 to 222. We had from 26 gigawatt to 41 gigawatt increase on solar. On wind, 45%. Our total renewables is 39%. And so we're going forward. The trajectory may change. So we had a huge input of LNG gas, I think 60% from US, but also from other sources. So we're all doing that. And so we're feeling the crunch. And the first thing my climate commissioner said today at the press briefing, and I don't know if you saw Reuters, is we want this COP to be the beginning of the end of fossil fuels. We will have to phase out of fossil fuels in full. And I think that's the best explanation of where we are, because he speaks on behalf of the whole EU. We are staying the course. And it's not going to be easy. We're going to hit snags. We're going to have some difficulties. And the just part of it, the fairness, so these fossil fuel subsidies, a lot of them were sent out for people to pay their bills. I think we should in the future be a bit smarter about it and give it to the most vulnerable and not just to everyone. But the just transition of this will be imperative to make sure that the legitimacy of this green transition will be maintained. Because yes, democracies and politics is something others don't have a monopoly on.
Meghan, you've written extensively about the challenges and the complexities of transforming our energy system, thinking about how do we have to tackle the deep-seated and deep-rooted reliance on fossil energy, what a clean energy economy can mean to a more secure energy future. We're in a oil-producing region. One pavilion over here at COP from the World Bank IMF pavilion is the Africa pavilion. I mean, there's people that have different resource base, different sets and circumstances and energy access. Can you elaborate just on the challenge of what we're talking about here and how we can embrace climate mitigation strategies to be empowering in that context?
Sure. The first thing that I would want to say actually is to Tony about the challenge that you described. injecting in that democratic piece and looking at Europe and thinking about how to manage the energy transition in the context of a rise in populism, and looking at the challenge of doing that and seeing the impact on European politics is an additional thing to navigate alongside those two things that we talked about. In terms of your question, Landon, I think that where I start from is looking at an energy system and thinking about whenever there's a big change in an energy system, it is going to bring with it a big change in geopolitics. You mentioned how there are, everyone has a different kind of energy reality, but we are connected by somewhat of a global energy system, and it is the backbone of the global economy. And if we're talking about remaking that global energy system, we have to anticipate that it is going to have differential impacts around the world. And so in terms of the work that I've done on writing about those impacts, I tried to highlight the fact that if we look to a net zero future, we may, with confidence, feel good about the geopolitical arrangements that might arise. In a world that is either one of net zero emissions or free of fossil fuels, some of the geopolitical challenges we see today will not be relevant for our geopolitical landscape. But the big challenge is really the transitional period, the next 20 or 27 years, where there'll be differential effects on the overall system that will create geopolitical reverberations, which won't always be kind of to our benefit. It's actually, I think geopolitics could get more turbulent rather than less turbulent in the short and medium run. And some of what Antonio said suggested that. So, there are a couple of ways we might think about that. The first is that we talk a lot about critical minerals, and critical minerals create, and the dominance of the critical mineral supply chain in China in particular creates new geopolitical vulnerabilities. Sure. And so navigating that will be key to a successful energy transition. There's also the exacerbating tensions between the North and the South that have resulted because of the inequities associated with climate impacts and the ability to make these transitions. So I think that that's the piece that I would focus on for the short and the medium term, which is alongside what Antonio said about navigating the energy security issue and the climate security issue at the same time.
So Atul, just drawing on your expertise, as we look at the lay of the land and announcements here in COP, we're hearing the complexity of the transformation. We're talking about the political consequence, the economic consequences. Let's talk about the technological consequences. It calls for 3x nuclear, calls for 3x nuclear or renewable. We can 3x nuclear. We're seeing a push on energy efficiency. I'm really curious what role you do think technology has and innovation has in enabling and making a smoother pathway for some of the issues we've discussed so far.
Yeah, so first thing I'll say is that, one thing we learned over the last 2 years since the Russia-Ukraine war is that there cannot be any transition without energy security. I think people forgot that energy security was important because prices were low, supplies were plentiful, but now we realize that energy transition has to be first priority security, then comes transition. Even for the most advanced, countries like the European Union has realized that. I think in terms of technology, one thing as a technologist I observe is that, and you can see it here in COP, is that people are very enthusiastic and optimistic about what's going to happen in the next 2 years or next 3 years, but not think about the longer term. And I think one thing we know about energy transition is that no matter what people think, it's an evolution. At the best, we can make it a fast evolution. We can't make it a revolution. We aren't going to wake up tomorrow and say, well, where is energy transition? So in terms of technologies, I think there's some good news here. We should celebrate that. Methane emissions, energy efficiency, renewables, those are all, in my view, low-hanging fruit. We know how to do that. We know how to detect methane now at a very high precision. Even offshore, we know. So let's focus on that. People haven't talked as much, although we said doubling the energy efficiency. I think it's still pretty vague. It needs to get to be much more granular as to what that would be. And by the way, that would be good for emissions, for energy security, for cost and everything else. I will just quickly run through 3 technologies which are going to be critical. One, which again hasn't been talked about as much, is storage. I think if we crack the code on long duration storage, and the definition is 8 hours or longer of continuous storage at scale meaning gigawatt scale or hundreds of megawatt scale. We are not there yet, but there's a lot of great work going on there. Other 2 technologies which have been talked about a lot more here, of course, is hydrogen and CCS. I think they're very different technologies. And for hydrogen, we should thank the US government and the IRA, and also to some extent for hydrogen as well. But the IRA is hopefully going to help us. And I think the big thing in the IRA is the hubs. See, again, going back to the history, I've worked in CCS for 25 years. Unfortunately, I have almost nothing to show for it. I hate to say that. And the reason being, we went into the hardest problem, which was carbon capture from power generation. It is low concentration, low pressure. Why did we do that? Because that's what we thought was important. But now we are getting to the real problems which are easier, from steel and cement and so on. Combine it with the hubs, store the carbon offshore, away from people, easier problem to solve. If you can do that in US, in Europe with things like Amsterdam or Northern North Sea, I think if you can do all that, that'll be great. And the oil and gas industry, which is always a popular target, including here, is going to be critical for CCS, for hydrogen, and also for offshore wind. So a lot of technology we can do, but it's going to take time. Let's not expect green hydrogen to be cost competitive in the next COP. It's probably not going to happen until we get to India COP or the COP beyond that.
Well, and I'm hearing rumors that 45V, for those not following the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, is predicated on decisions that the Department of Treasury will make in terms of how additionality, how the hourly matching, and how clean the hydrogen is near inevitable and on the cusp of being announced. So we'll see how big our hydrogen sector is, but we don't know. Really quick follow-up, Atul, on this topic. I believe it might even been Carlos Pascual, one of your colleagues at S&P, talking about dissecting the International Energy Agency's net zero roadmaps, and that when you look at that and you really scale it back, up to 50% of the emissions reductions are based on technologies that aren't yet deployable. So the question, or aren't yet economic, just commercial. And so I think the question I have for you is, are we seeing an ecosystem built here in the world's biggest climate and energy conference at COP28 to be able to overcome those challenges and achieve that outlook?
Yeah, I think it's, again, I would say a bit early to say because there have been a lot of promises made. I think we'll have to go back home and figure out, how much all of that adds up. However, even in this region, we are seeing, big effort to scale CCS and hydrogen, including here in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia. So it's a matter of time. Remember, these technologies, as I remind people as an engineer, you have to put steel in the ground, and putting steel in the ground is like watching paint dry. It's the same process, right? So it's going to take time. But there is a lot of good innovation going around the world, and of course in the US, and where I live in Boston, tremendous amount of innovation going. So I think that's all very promising for us.
Tony, I saw a quick two-finger.
No, very briefly, on hydrogen, it's also good to know that in the EU we made a big push to create this kind of market with a hydrogen market to increase production and have partnerships with northern African countries because they have comparative advantages with solar. But on technology, I like to start, we love technology and we need CCUS. But also we have to be, and I'm not accusing you of this, but there are some powers and companies out there who have a magic asterisk and say CCUS as if this is the best thing since sliced bread. But if I'm correct, and you can correct me, at the moment we've got it deployed 0.1%. The capture intensity is not 90 to 95% what you need, but it depends on what you're doing, and this is power capture. And in 2030, it's guesstimated that we'll have like less than 1%. So while we need it for residual and hard-to-abate sectors, let's not anyone think that this technology is the silver bullet, and some will even use it as a fig leaf to actually expand and continue the business model of eking out the last drop of oil that's in the ground. And there, the additionality that you mentioned is crucial. So I just want to put that perspective. We need these technologies, we need it for residual, but they alone are not like the magic bullet for all of this.
Very, very quickly. We have about 40 million tons of CCS today globally, which is almost nothing. The target, most agreed target is 400 million tons by 2030. That's times 10. We need to be at a gigaton to really make a mark. And if you can get to even 400 or higher than 400 by 2030, if we don't crack the code, I agree to some extent, don't crack the code on CCS by 2030, I think we need a different plan.
I see the passion of 3 decades plus on CCS there, yes. And let's make sure the next 5 years give a little opportunity to that technology. But I want to bring this, Antonio, I want to bring the conversation back to you and reference something that Meghan alluded to earlier about the future of the energy system being predicated on minerals, metals, and other aspects that's going to diversify how we think about the energy system and how we think about energy security in that complex. And one big facet of that relationship, frankly, is the U.S.-China relationship. Yeah. And this increasing polarization, this increasing fracturization around, especially post-COVID, how we do supply chains, how we engage in constructively financing the energy transition. You heard some conversation about what is effectively trade policy and political support through the IRA, through the mechanisms that Europe's deploying. Can we talk a little bit about, elaborate on the fragmentation of the energy system and the geopolitical tensions that we need to overcome, and your vision of how to do that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. If before it was difficult to talk about energy transition and security, now becomes even more difficult because you added another challenge, energy transition, energy security plus fragmentation. So how to deal with these three challenges together? Well, trade, also in this case, trade and energy transitions go together for at least 4 reasons. First reason is a standard trade argument that more trade means more growth, given that you need more resources to do the green transition, to have more growth is positive. Second, we have learned that a lot of technologies really improve by learning by doing. So you need a big market to run down to improve efficiency and run down the cost. And this is very clear for a solar panel. Basically, this is a big progress that was done in China, was thanks to an integrated world. So this was very important. Third, which is as important, and goes back to what you said before, Antonio, is that innovation is key. And we know that having a large market is important for innovation. And having standards, not only market size, but also standard is very, very important. And we have been doing some work at the IMF, and our managing director has talked about this, and there will be a paper on this. So market size is important also for innovation. Finally, fourth reason is that we know that green transition will require some new materials, some new critical minerals. And we know that at the moment we don't have a good substitute, and I'm talking about copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium. The demand for this mineral will go up a lot. We do estimate that even without fragmentation, the price for this material will go up on average 30%, by 90%, sorry, by the end of the decade. If there is fragmentation, the price will go up much more because various blocks need to assure this. We do estimate with some simulation that they can go up to 300%. And this will have a negative effect on the adoption of electric vehicle or other things, because if you increase the price of critical material. So I gave 4 reasons why trade is very important for a good green transition. General argument about trade. Second, it will run down the cost of green technology. Third, for innovation. And fourth, for critical material.
So it's a complex space, but we're not starting from zero. Meghan, when I think about actions being taken in capitals around the world, there is an effort to create and bring back stability to the supply chain, both current, but specifically in the context of this conversation, over a much longer arc in the energy transition. What are you seeing in terms of that, that avenue for engagement globally to help prevent the instability that is a risk in the energy transition right now?
Sure. Let me talk about a few things that I see countries doing, in the U.S. in particular, to try to address the situation, and then a couple of big judgments about it that are particularly not widely appreciated, maybe on Capitol Hill in Washington per se. So I'd say the first thing that many countries are trying to do is to just try to increase domestic production. And that is because, as we all know, that these critical minerals are actually widely found around the world. So even though they're right now heavily concentrated, in fact, the concentration of many of the critical minerals that Antonio mentioned is actually much more concentrated in a singular country than oil or natural gas is around the world. That is not because of geology, it's because of just the way that these minerals have been developed. So there's an effort to increase production. That's through taxes and subsidies and other things. This is actually harder than it sounds because the markets for many of these minerals is quite small, and the transparency of the markets is not very great. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in these markets, and that becomes an obstacle to investment. So in many cases, investors may be nervous about making big capital investments that will only bear fruit over a 10, 15-year period when they know the U.S. government, for instance, is putting big money into try to developing alternatives or to develop technology for recycling, or that China may decide to dump a lot of minerals on the market and lower the price. And so there's a desire to increase production, but again, that is more difficult than it sounds because of the uncertainty, and also the biggest constraint, at least on the United States and Canada, to areas where there are a lot of minerals, has to do with permitting, and that is a deeply political issue that we can tinker with in the United States, but I think we're unlikely to have a real breakthrough there just because of politics. The second of the three strands, I would say, is this effort to find alternatives, alternative substances, and to recycle. And that, I think, will be consequential, but it's probably less consequential than one might think. You might think you could solve the problem just by pursuing this. The International Energy Agency actually anticipates that at best by 2040, increases in the ability to recycle would mean that our supply needs go down by about 10% by 2040 across a range of these minerals. So that's significant, important to pursue, but it's not a panacea. And then the last piece relates a lot to what I think you were saying about trade. Another thing has to do with diversifying supply chains, and the whole concept of friendshoring being one that there's a lot of enthusiasm for that. And I think there's still a long way to go in terms of actually getting that investment in other economies, developing supply chains, but also developing the mechanisms, which may end up being like free trade agreements or other agreements that allow for the movement of minerals produced in one place to flow to other parts of the world. So part of the diversifying supply chains also involves using creative diplomatic tools to, there are these mineral supply architectures, new agreements to try to coordinate a variety of countries in terms of investment and other things that can be a constraint on supply. So those are the three main avenues. And just very briefly, I would say, in terms of the judgment, there's a lot that can be done here that can address what many policymakers in parts of the world regard as a big strategic vulnerability, and that is the concentration of these supply chains in in China. But I would say, one, this will take some time, and two, it is inconceivable to me, looking at the policy landscape and domestic politics in the United States and other Western democracies, that these changes will replace China's role in this trade. So China is going to have a significant role in the critical minerals trade as it becomes a bigger and bigger part of the overall energy trade. And that, I think, can be mitigated, but we shouldn't pretend that this energy transition can be done without China, because it can't be. I think that there's just too many political, social, economic, and diplomatic obstacles to think that these needs can be met without China playing a significant role.
It will be interesting to watch how energy security and China's dominance does begin to weigh on policymakers' decisions in the West. And, you think about something like long-haul trucking, where, the United States has gone on light-duty vehicles and kind of said, okay, we're ready for batteries. It's the right thing to do for climate. When it comes to long-haul trucking infrastructure, something that the U.S. relies on, and we built an ecosystem around how to build our economy and push it out, do we allow that to be seeded in the same way to a country like China and that value chain?
Well, again, I think this gets into the realm of politics. Yeah. And I think the case study, which is about to unfold before our eyes, actually gets to electric vehicles and China's production of electric vehicles, and what I think many anticipate will be China's growing dominance in the export market for electric vehicles. That if, as many anticipate, China is able to produce higher quality electric vehicles at lower prices, then it would seem relevant that these vehicles would, make their way into European and American markets at very large scale. So the question is that are policymakers in the United States and other places going to be comfortable with that, or are they going to see that as some kind of strategic challenge to very important industries in those countries? So I don't know how much my predictions are worth, but it's hard for me to imagine that in this context there wouldn't be a political response.
Atul, we'll judge your carbon offsets later, but I know you're going around the world and you're hearing about a lot of policymakers' perspectives on this. Can we square, when you're thinking about the businesses and the world leaders that you're talking to, can we square the economic and security interests of particular nations with an enabling environment that we need for the energy supply chain of the future?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm looking for high-quality offsets to offset. So hopefully I'll find some here in Dubai. I think I kind of agree with pretty much everything Meghan is saying, but there are a few things for us to keep in mind. One is that, there are no shortage of minerals, but we haven't really looked for minerals in a hard way, particularly some of those. And now, one of the things I'm observing is how is the oil and gas industry, which employs thousands of geologists, where are they putting their effort? And they're starting to look for some of these. So hopefully that will help. But I think we need to think about mining or extraction separate from processing. And one of the things which is easier to do, I think Meghan, you would agree, is to diversify processing, because it's easier to set up, it's easier to scale, and you just need the minerals to be transported, which has its own carbon footprint. But so I think that's one of the strategies governments can take, is to help with processing and permitting for processing. In my worldwide travel, as you alluded to, Landon, I talked to some of the mining executives. And one of the most interesting things I learned is, first of all, nobody loves mining, by the way, okay? You know what is the PE of the world's largest mining company? It's 2, okay? Why would anybody in that company want to invest in opening a new mine? They have no money to invest in new mine. And now on the top of it, there are ESG criteria which make it even more difficult to get money to invest in mining. So I think this is another issue. We need to square the circle to say, well, actually, we need some mines, and we need them in more stable places, as Meghan is saying. So I think we need to think about how to bring them out. The last thing I will say is that again, innovation, nobody really needed a lot of these minerals, but now there's innovation happening, and I'll give you one tiny example, because I think I'm probably the only petroleum engineer in this crowd. In the petroleum engineering world, we produce a lot of water. Actually, we produce more water than we produce oil, and the water is saline. It has, salt in it, but it also has lithium in it. And you may have read recently that these big companies are getting into lithium. They're not getting into lithium mining. They're getting into lithium extraction from this saline water. And it's as little as 50 to 100 parts per million. This is just early days, but my view is that I think we're going to see a lot more innovation from these companies to, and again, we need more innovation, we need more diversification, and all of that is going to happen. But the mining industry in particular needs a little bit more love than I think they have been given over the last, multiple decades. I think Meghan is going to say something on that.
Yeah. Tony, I'm going to go to Tony, though, really quick. I'm going to give a two-part question here. One's really specific. No. It's building on something Meghan said earlier about the inexpensive EVs. I am curious your reaction and how, if there's any market where that's penetrating already, it is Europe. And I'm curious if you're seeing a political response to that and how it's weighing. I also want to think through, in this idea of a fractured world, we're watching, BRICS, for example, become a more powerful influence. We've seen world leaders, even today, with President Vladimir Putin visiting the UAE, and ultimately, other aspects like that, countervailing the G7, for example, OPEC versus IEA. Like, there's a lot of multilateral aspect to this as well. So curious about the political fortitude of Europe in the face of inexpensive external goods. Also curious about multilateralism as an enabler for this process.
That's all?
That's it.
So first on critical raw materials, because I want to say something, because this is a very important discussion and it's something we in the EU have to deal with. So we have our Critical Raw Materials Act, which we adopted, which says in 2030 we want to extract and mine 10%. We want to process 40%, and we want to have, it's more than recycling, we want to have circularity of 25%, because circularity is going to be a big part. And when it comes to the ESG, for us, it is important. There are always trade-offs. We need these minerals. We need to get them, but we need to keep sustainability of that mining there. That's not easy, but it's part of the trade-off. You can't have everything, but we find a good balance. We also want to establish partnerships with source countries and rich countries that can buy them. Maybe we should have a critical raw material club where we can have all these different standards and these agreements, these partnerships. So we're trying to diversify as much as we can, but Meghan's fully right. You can't just cut out one country, but we want to make sure that instead of 93% dependency, it will be 65 maximum dependency on one single country. So that's how we're trying to get our clean industry going in the EU. Then to cars. The way we've set it up is, and we recently just adopted and agreed, and it was a little bit of a kerfuffle, is that in 2035, the only car that can be sold on the European market will be emission-free, which is most probably going to be electric. And there was a little bit of a kerfuffle because part of the auto industry said, but we want it still to be available to have e-fuels. Well, we don't think anyone's going to put e-fuels into a car because it's way too expensive. And by the way, you need to have a sensor to say, because if you have a combustible engine where you can put e-fuel in, you can also put gasoline in. That was a difficult discussion. I think we've parked it. And indeed, the biggest argument was that at the moment, there are like 80 models that are qualitatively good, affordable Chinese models that are coming into our market. So, we got to deal with that. And the worst thing you can do is to back off. And very interesting in the UK, when the Prime Minister of the UK suddenly announced they had a 2030 EV deadline, that he pushed it up to 2035. And this is interesting how the industry reacts. The first one to react was Ford, to say, wait a minute, we're relying on the regulatory security. So I think that's interesting. Finally, to the multilateral order, President von der Leyen of the European Commission had this philosophy, which I think the President of the United States has encompassed in his rhetoric. I'm not sure in the US politics that has also been embedded in its DNA, is de-risk but not decouple. Because if we start coming into a Manichaean world, there's a lot of pain there. So what we're trying to do, and time will tell whether we are successful, is to treat China, yes, it is a rival in terms of its political system. It is a partner in other issues. And so we're trying to find our way. And interestingly enough, when you talk about the multilateral order, the world is ripping at the seams as we're looking at it now. Different WTO, OSCE, UN Security Council. Arguably the one platform of global diplomacy where almost everyone speaks to each other is at COP. And it's at COP because it's of climate. And it's because of climate, because it's an existential issue where you cannot sit in the same boat, and say only your part is sinking. So whose delegations are next to each other? It's the US and China. Who has been talking to each other from the beginning of COP? It's Spec Carey and Xi Jinping, the special climate envoy. And that is a good thing. So I have a hope that through climate, we can actually show that global diplomacy can deliver and is necessary, because it is a world at risk. And if we don't watch out, we can lose a heck of a lot.
Antonio, we're running out of time, and so what I want to do is close it out with a question to you about multilateralism. Obviously, the IMF, you're uniquely positioned to think about this, both from the diplomatic angle, but also I think particularly from the financial angle, which I find increasingly salient in this debate as we watch CBAMs and other aspects of the climate conversation enter the equation. Can you wrap this up by giving us some hope, perhaps, on where we can take multilateralism as a function for enabling this transition?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. No, multilateralism is in our DNA. We are a multilateral organization, so we don't. We take it very seriously as our mission, and we don't. I would say three ways where we can help. One is, I would say, mutual understanding. We can model the macro implication of various paths to transition. Every country can choose different paths, and some paths, and you need to explain to other partners to avoid a run to the bottom somehow. And I think that thanks to our models, our analytical work, we can really help the mutual understanding of the various players. Second is about the facilitating financing of the green transition. We have been quite active in the way of to channel resources to private resources, blending to emerging markets, and this facilitates the green transition, of course, and eases a lot of tension as well. Finally, we have some facility of stakeholders' money, RST, Resilience and Sustainability Trust, to help countries, poor countries that really need the resources to tackle climate change. And this is also very important to assuage tensions.
Well, we'll have to end it there just as we wrap up. I can see, obviously, a lot to think about, and even as we pursue a new energy system, I don't think it's any less complex in terms of the political and security aspects of it, but let's have a little hope, both from the conversation around technology and also the work we're doing in the context of multilateralism. Thank you to the Financial Times, the World Bank, the IMF, for hosting this delegation, this panel, and please join me in thanking them for their time.
Thank you. Thank you. That was fun.